Hello, and welcome to our fourth and final part of Unravelling, where we're going to be turning to the issues of sex, sexuality, and marriage. We really hope that you've been watching along so far with us, but if you haven't, we would really encourage you to go back and look at all of the content we've got in parts one right up to part four, because there's so much there for you to watch. We keep saying this, don't we, Tim? Every time
Yeah.
we start a new video, go back, look at what we've done
Yeah.
before. Why do we keep asking people to do that?
The reason is really that we might think that our views on sex and sexuality and marriage are obvious or
Yep.
common sense or the way that everybody should think. But as we've seen repeatedly through Unravelling, the way we see anything is massively shaped by our worldview, the
Yep.
glasses through which we see the world. And if we've got different glasses, then we may be looking at the same thing. But because of the glasses we're wearing, we're seeing a very different picture and then having very different reactions to it. So my sense of justice and injustice, my sense of morality, my internal reactions to whatever it is we're talking about will be shaped by my worldview and yours will be shaped by yours. So if we're going to have a conversation where we can talk meaningfully about these issues rather than talking past each other, we need to understand not just what we think, but why we think
Why
what
we're
we
thinking.
think and how we got there. And so that's why it's important. That's what we've tried to do
Yep.
in the earlier parts of Unraveling. We've deliberately put sex, sexuality, marriage in part four,
Okay.
to say that really you need to walk through parts one, two, and three to have that meaningful
Yeah.
conversation about these issues.
Yeah. As I said, we've covered a lot of ground
Yeah.
in all of those videos, and we're building on that tonight, aren't we? Really.
Yeah.
And so this evening we're turning towards looking at the view of sex in our culture.
That's right. We want to say, generally, in our cultural worldview, what do we think about sex, sexuality, and marriage? And then how is that playing out in practice?
Great. And presumably, when we've looked at worldviews before, we've often looked at what's happened in the past.
Yeah.
And again, I'm guessing the past has shaped where we are now.
Yeah. The way that we see sex now stretches back as we've gone in the earlier parts of Unravelling hundreds of years back into the Enlightenment, the formation of our worldview now. That's why we need to go through that to understand where we are now. But it's fair to say, I think, that our cultural view on sex really gained critical mass in the sexual revolution of the 60s.
Yeah, I think we've all heard of the sexual revolution, even in a vague sense.
Yeah.
But what actually happened?
Well, I wonder if this image is familiar to you at all.
Is that Woodstock?
This is Woodstock, a music festival, a famous music festival now that happened in 1969, which was meant to be about peace and free love and plenty of drugs and
Hmm.
sex and young adults. And um, this moment really has become a symbol of what the 60s were all about in this sense.
Yeah.
This breakthrough moment where a worldview that had been building for centuries, as we've seen, in the realm of sex in particular, broke through in the 60s and transformed really the way that our society thought about sex and behaved. And its impact's massive. And that's really what we're exploring tonight is the ongoing impact of this new view of sex that became dominant
Yeah.
in this time.
Okay. So, how would you summarize how this new view of sex sort of was emerging in the sexual revolution?
So, in the sexual revolution, our view of sex becomes radically individualistic, really. And perhaps the best way to explain that is to return a little bit to a flow diagram that we've used in part one of Unraveling, but particularly think about sex and our
Yeah.
view of sex. So, in this cultural worldview that was emerging, becoming dominant, then the starting point is that God isn't real,
Yeah.
and therefore all we have is nature. Hopefully, that sentence is familiar.
Yeah.
But what that means really is that we are constructing our own reality now. We're constructing what's meaningful, what's good, what's true, including moral values. So, with regards to sex, it means that it's what I think and feel and experience about sex that
Okay.
really determines um, my view of sex and its
Mhm.
morality and
Mhm.
what we should and shouldn't do. And because our sexual feelings are among some of the strongest that we have, aren't they? The feelings of attraction, sexual desire towards others, these are really strong internal feelings. So they become pretty powerful
Yeah.
constructors of our reality. And various thinkers like Freud and Reich that we've looked at earlier in Unravelling, they argued that repressing these feelings was actually harmful to us and
Yeah.
to human flourishing, and that we needed to find ways to truly express our inner thoughts and feelings around sex. And if those are your foundations, then that takes you to certain conclusions that we see coming in the sexual revolution. And so I've put them up here really. So first of all, if these things are true, then satisfying my sexual desires is absolutely key to who I am.
Right.
So this is the identity story. Do you remember
Yes.
a whole
Yeah.
video on that? This is the
Yeah.
identity story playing out in the realm of sex.
Yeah.
I am my inner world, what I think and feel. And so my sexual desires are a core part, fulfilling them as a
Part of
core
who I
part of
am.
being who I am. Yeah. And therefore, if that's true, and if those feelings are really strong, then it's no surprise that sexual or romantic love becomes my greatest need
Hmm.
and my greatest pleasure.
Okay.
Um, and then if that's true, we can push it further into the power and oppression story. Well, if this is my greatest need and greatest pleasure and who I am, then any resistance to this, any opposition to this, or different view about my right to express my sexual identity, it becomes unjust and oppressive
Okay.
and something to be resisted. And I think we see all of that coming to the fore in the sexual revolution and its legacy afterwards. So, this is the results of that worldview, but it's not the total answer to why things happened when they did, because if this worldview's been around for ages, developing for ages, why in the 60s did
Yeah.
it
Why
break
then?
through? So, I think the other part of the puzzle is to say that there were some really important medical technological developments really around
Mhm.
the time. Say, for example, in the 50s, you get the widespread availability of penicillin, which is made a big difference in terms of reducing the risk of death from things like syphilis.
Okay.
But most important of all was the contraceptive pill, which became widely available in the 60s.
Yeah.
And obviously, that dramatically reduced the risks to women of casual sex
Yeah.
and pregnancy. And so that's a big part of the answer of why the 60s,
Like why it all came together then.
yeah, why the sexual revolution really gets off the ground then. So I think if you hold all of that together, this then is the context in which the permissive society comes in, which has been playing out now for around 60 years. A set of beliefs that leads to a way of behaving that really sums up where we've got to. Um, and that's what I want to explore this evening, really, then. So, where has this left us as a culture and our beliefs around sex?
Okay. So how are we going to do that then? How are we going to explore that?
So, the first point I want to make is that for us in our culture, eros has become ultimate.
Okay.
So, by eros is a Greek word for love that particularly refers to sexual or romantic love. So, it's where we get erotic from,
Yeah.
for example. And throughout human history, we've always known that we need love. To give and receive love is part of being human. But there are a lot of different kinds of loves. And at different times, certain kinds of loves has been more or less important and been seen differently. That's the worldview glasses stuff that we've talked
Yeah.
about before. But for us in our culture now, because there's no God,
Yeah.
there's no divine love or transcendent love that's available for us. So all that we have left are human loves.
Yeah. The love
That's the
between each
first
other
step.
and okay.
And even in human loves, there's a lot of different kind of loves. So there's the love that you might have in a friendship,
Mhm.
the love that you might have in a family between parent and child, say, and there's the love that you have with your lover,
Mhm.
a kind of eros, erotic love. But in our culture, what's happened is that kind of love has clearly become the primary thing
Yeah.
that we are encouraged to desire
Okay.
and to see as the solution to our needs and our problems. So, if you look at most of our films and our songs and our stories, all these cultural carriers that tell us
Yeah.
stories that shape our worldview, more often than not, erotic love
Roman-
is seen as the pinnacle. Yeah, this is the thing that's going to satisfy you. This is the thing that's going to meet your needs. So I think that is we're all sort of absorbing that all the time, and it's shaping us to really believe that this is our greatest need, and therefore it is centered to our identity. It's centered to our sense of what we need to get out of life,
Yeah.
and can lead to that sense of injustice or oppression if we feel like anyone is denying us
Okay.
the chance to express and discover um, that romantic love. So in all these ways, I think eros has become ultimate, and that's a clear characterization of how we see sex in our culture as the most important thing in that sense.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And I think I can see, with that kind of view, how sex has become really everything
yeah,
in our culture. And it's interesting that that is a natural consequence of a world without God, that
yeah,
becomes the most important kind of love, as you
yeah,
say.
yeah.
If it's if that's the best route, that's all we can hope for.
Exactly. It's all that we've got. And therefore, it does become this central thing in my identity where sex is no longer something that I do.
Hmm.
That's one way that we might have seen sex. It's a behavior, it's an activity, it's something we do. But for us, it has become who I am.
Yeah.
And that's a very different way of seeing sex, really. And I think this has increased rapidly in recent years. So even when I was a teenager, um, I think we still, first of all, secured our identity with one another in our friendships by things like the music that we
Yeah.
liked or the clothes that we wore. Um, I was an emo. That was like
I
your
was a
badge of
child.
these are the barrier, the sort of boundaries of identity that we had back then. But as I talk to college students now, they say the experience is quite different. Often the first thing you learn about each other now is actually your gender and sexual identity. And that's how we're primarily defining ourselves, and almost the first step in getting to know one another. Whereas even a couple of decades ago, that
Yeah.
would have been sort of quite far down the road, really.
Yeah.
So in some ways, sex for us is everything, but in other ways, it's nothing.
So, do you mean that in the way that we can sort of see sex as I can have sex with someone and it can be no big deal?
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly what I mean. We saw in early parts of Unravelling how in our cultural worldview, it becomes easy for us to detach our body from our soul or from our inner world, if you want to use that kind of language instead. And if we separate the two, then it becomes easy to say that sex is just something that I do with my body that doesn't have a profound impact on the rest of me.
Okay.
Um, and that is the attitude that lies underneath our hookup culture,
Hmm.
where your sex is just sex
Yeah.
and it's only meaningful if we choose to make it meaningful. It's not really meaningful in and of itself. And we can see just how much this has changed even in recent decades. There was some really interesting research done by King's College London Policy Institute that showed that back in 1999, only 10% of the British public thought that casual sex was morally justifiable. Whereas last year that had risen to 42%.
Okay.
And that surprised me. I thought that number was a bit low. My guess would have been even more than
Yeah.
42% of people now
Mm.
wouldn't see a problem with casual sex. But that shows just how much attitudes have shifted, even
In
over
a short,
recent decades.
short time.
So sexual revolution's still growing in some ways as time goes on. So can you see the massive contradiction that's going on here, really? That on the one hand, sex is everything. It's your identity. It's who you are. It's really important. On the other hand, it's nothing. You can have sex with whoever you want, and it
Doesn't
doesn't
really
really
matter.
matter. It's only meaningful if you make it meaningful. And I think there's other ways that the contradiction plays out as well. Say, for example, um, with rape, we don't consider rape just to be the same as any other kind of physical assault.
Hmm.
We see it to be a particularly bad and damaging form of physical assault. And that's why, kind of, with the Me Too movement in recent years, there's been a huge push for greater justice for those who've suffered sexual assault. Um, so, sex isn't nothing for us in that
Yeah.
sense, but then it does become nothing for us when we start, if it feels right, just do it,
Hmm.
regardless of wider considerations, really. So, sex is everything and nothing, but I think in reality, we know that it can't be nothing.
Yeah.
Um, and the question is it everything really? But we are having to live in that contradiction all the time in our culture, which, yeah, I'm not sure that's tenable, if that makes sense.
Yeah. I think, yeah, when you point
Yeah,
out the contradiction, even just off the top of my head, you can think of examples where we see that all the time play out in the media and just, even in our own social media things or whatever we see, it's always being played out. Sex is everything, or the search for love is everything. But at the same time, it can just be casual. It doesn't
yeah,
matter.
yeah.
So, yeah, I can see that a lot.
I think and hopefully we'll dig a little bit more into that a bit later in the evening, but as long as the main point's clear, really. And then I can move us on perhaps to our third point, that sex in our culture, a big part of sex in our culture is that sex sells.
Okay.
So, why is it that everything that we advertise, from cars to fragrances to holidays to,
Clothes.
involves skimpy models, kind of? And the reason is because the commercial world knows that this sells, this hooks us in, this grabs our attention, this makes us more likely to spend money. And some of the authors who have written about this have described this strategy, if you like, as limbic capitalism.
Okay.
So yeah, what they mean by that is that the limbic system is a part of our brain that operates on a sort of sub-rational level. It's to do with our motivations and desires that are sub-rational, including the things that often sex and sexual images stimulate in us. And so limbic capitalism refers to the attempt to sell us stuff and to grab and hold our attention by activating that limbic system in our brain,
Right.
primarily through sex, if you
Okay.
like.
Yeah.
And so this is present in social media and how social media works. But perhaps it's most obvious in the pornography industry, which is a big part of sex in our culture as well. So pornography really is sex stripped of any relational context and packaged in a way that's designed to maximally trigger that limbic system in us, to addict us, to hold our attention, and then to
To
monetize
make
that
money.
and to sell money through it. Yeah. And so pornography is a highly addictive thing. It sort of impacts our brains similarly to other highly addictive substances, creates the same sort of addictive cycles and neural pathways. Um, but obviously pornography is largely accepted in our
Mm.
culture, um, or at least in some way. We'll maybe see some of the complexities of that as we go on. But this is despite the fact that by all those who have really researched and looked into it, pornography is a terrible industry for the people who are involved in producing it, predominantly women. The impact's fairly horrific on the women who produce pornography. And pornography is also really damaging for those who use it, which is most of us now in our culture. Say the statistics would say that the vast majority of men and a significant proportion of women are regular users of pornography, even though we know the negative impacts
Hmm.
that that has. And, you know, to get some sort of handle on just how big a player in our culture the pornography industry is, it might be worth saying that MindGeek is the company that owns Pornhub, the biggest porn site in the world, and several of the other really big porn sites. Well, they have more daily internet traffic than Facebook and Instagram and Twitter combined.
Wow.
Um, Somebody estimated that the pornography industry is probably worth about $200 billion a year.
Okay.
So this is a huge play. If we want to understand what's going on in sex in our
Yeah.
culture, you have to factor in pornography and the impact of pornography, really. But despite it being such a big deal, and despite it really being quite damaging in many ways, we largely accept it as at least a kind of morally neutral phenomenon in a matter of personal choice.
So, if it's, if it does have a negative impact on
Yeah,
people as you're claiming,
yeah,
why then as a culture do we just accept it and allow it to
yeah.
kind of continue and be on such a big scale as well?
And I think that question brings us to the last point, really, about sex in our culture, which is that the only moral boundaries that we generally agree to about sex now are those of consent and harm. So I want to quote here an author called Louise Perry. She wrote a book called The Case Against the Sexual Revolution. So the clue in the title, it
Yeah, yeah.
goes to the direction that she's arguing. But we're going to come back to her writing a fair bit in the rest of this evening. And she wrote, the only defense that the porn industry has when presented with its hideous list of crimes is its own version of the sexual liberation narrative. Everyone is consenting, everyone is an adult, the women like it, and who are you to say otherwise? And this is quite a striking way of putting things, but I think she's put her finger on something important, which is that consent and harm are probably the two agreed moral values that are the only basis really for us making judgments about sex in
Okay.
our culture that we're willing to share. So it's generally accepted that all parties have to consent for a sexual act to be moral. That's why rape
So that's the
is
first
wrong.
check. Yep.
That's why paedophilia is wrong, because we, at the moment anyway, we consider children too young to be able to consent, and therefore that's why that's wrong. But that's basically it. I mean, you've probably come across this argument before, that if everyone's consenting,
Yeah.
what's the
What's the
problem?
problem? Yep.
As Louise Perry, right, like, who are you to say otherwise?
Hmm.
So we've got the consent principle, and the other principle we tend to all agree with is the harm principle. Say, whatever's going on, it shouldn't be hurting anyone.
Okay.
But we do tend to define harm in quite a reductionistic way. Say we talk about, if something's harmful, there has to be the intent to harm.
Right.
There's always unintended consequences. Sometimes we might do a morally fine thing, but accidentally someone gets hurt. So there has to be the intent to harm. Usually our definition of harm is quite short term and immediate. Say, is someone actually being harmed in
It is
this
actually
immediate
this moment.
act?
Okay.
We wouldn't tend to look at wider impact over a longer period of
Yeah.
time. And generally we focus on physical and mental harm because these are easier to quantify and measure.
Yeah.
Um, Spiritual harm
Or soul
or
harm.
emotional harm, we sometimes are able to say something about emotional harm, but they're often harder to pin anything on.
Yeah.
So harm is usually
Yeah.
physical and mental. And so it's worth saying that sometimes these principles of consent and harm can actually come into tension as well. What if you consent to be harmed?
Mm.
As is the case in kind of rough sex and some of the sexual fetishes and interests that, under that label of rough
Yeah.
sex is a very general label, but it is increasingly common for people to consent to be harmed.
Yeah.
And that is raising questions for us in our culture that we're not too sure how to handle, because these are the moral
Yeah.
principles we have, and how do we balance um, the one against the other, really?
Okay. So the picture that you've painted, sort of in sex in our culture, do you think that that relates to how we see marriage at all?
Mm,
Um,
mm.
would you say that sort of marriage and sex are totally different, or how would you
I think they are connected in our cultural worldview, but they're mainly connected in the sense that they've become disconnected.
say more?
Hey, in our culture, marriage and sex have now been separated, really. There
Right.
was a time where sex and marriage were much more tightly connected together,
Hmm.
whereas now um, people don't wait until they're married to have
Yeah.
sex. And for most people, we assume that people get married. When people get married, they continue to have sex. That's
Hmm.
what we tend to assume.
Yeah.
But it's not a necessary connection now. Getting married doesn't change sex lives of most
Mm.
people. Um, so marriage, how do we see marriage in our culture then? Well, I think the best way to sum up how we see marriage is by saying that marriage now for us is companionate, which might
Okay.
be a new word,
Yeah.
or romantic. Say, and they mean the same sort of thing, really. This companionate or romantic view of marriage.
Yeah.
And I want to quote another author to help us understand that. So this is an author called Todd Wilson, who we will come back to again the next video that we do together. But he explains it like this: on this understanding, marriage is primarily about companionship, a deep, intimate, lasting relationship with another person. Marriage is an enduring commitment you make to another person because of an intense emotional connection you have with that person. So, a happy marriage, therefore, is one based on intense feelings of attraction toward another person. It's rooted in a sense that marriage fulfills our emotional and relational needs in a unique way. I think that's a pretty accurate description of how most people in our culture think about marriage.
Yeah.
So, we talk about finding our other half,
Hmm.
finding our best friend. We talk about our soulmate or our forever person. And I think all those terms get at what Todd Wilson's describing here for us. Um, at least I imagine that resonates.
Yeah,
That,
definitely. Yeah, like you say, like that sort of language that we use of finding my other half and all
yeah,
that sort of stuff. That's definitely how we see it in our culture. But I'm guessing that, well, I know that a lot less people are getting married
yeah,
nowadays than they used to, aren't they?
yeah. So marriage is declining from an earlier point anyway. So again, statistically, back in 1968, only 8% of children were born outside of marriage.
Okay.
Whereas now it's nearly half of all children are born outside of marriage. That's kind of Office of National Statistics. Um, and and many more marriages end in divorce. So well over 40% of marriages now end in divorce. And I think the point I want to make is that these are not just accidental phenomenon, they're the natural consequence of our view of marriage. Because if our view of marriage is this romantic view where it's about emotional connection and for feeling fulfilled in your emotional and relational needs, then as soon as that stops being the case for you, there's no particular reason to stay in the marriage, particularly if you haven't got children.
Yeah, and I think even a lot of people in struggling marriages will often say that, they'll sometimes just say they're staying together for the children,
Yeah,
won't
for the
they?
children, and then often when the children grow up and leave home, then they will get divorced,
Mhm.
and so it becomes a delayed thing.
So I'm guessing you want to suggest that there's another way to view marriage.
Yeah, the next video where we look at a Christian worldview, we'll look at a Christian worldview of marriage, which includes some of the aspects of this romantic view of marriage, but really sees marriage quite differently and what it's fundamentally about. But that's for then.
Okay.
This is for now. This is where we are in our culture now. Um, but although sex is a part of marriage, really marriage is independent of sex. Sex can go on
Yep.
outside of marriage. And so marriage becomes about this emotional fulfillment, relational fulfillment for us. And marriage as an institution then is just the state recognition of this relationship that we enter into around which we organise various parts of our society.
Okay. So are you talking about all kinds of marriages here? Are we saying heterosexual marriages, gay marriages, civil ceremonies?
Yeah, I think any of those forms of marriage in our culture, the primary way we see that marriage is the companionate view, is the
Mhm.
romantic view. And if that is what marriage is, then there is no reason to distinguish between them. And the UK change of law back in 2013 actually makes a lot of sense, really, which I guess takes us on to our final point on sexuality.
Which is what then?
So, understanding the way we see sexualities in our culture, we have to go back to the identity story and the power and oppression story that we have talked so much about,
Yeah,
Liz,
go back to the start.
over the weeks. So, if how we think and feel is the primary thing that defines my identity, given that our sexual feelings are so strong, no wonder then that our sexuality, our sexual feelings have become one of the most, if not the most important point of identity in our culture
Yeah.
today. Um, and if the identity story is true, then um, whatever our sexual identity, whether it's straight, gay, bisexual, polyamorous, queer, or whatever, these sexual identities become self-justifying. They're how I feel,
Yeah.
they're who I am. And then to ask moral questions about them. Is it right that
Okay.
I might feel like this, or the behaviors that I might attach to those moral questions become increasingly nonsensical for us in our culture because it's who you are,
Yeah.
it's how you feel, and it's self-justifying in that sense. And in fact, the only moral values that become important in this area are those of consent and harm,
Yeah.
as we explored earlier. And so for us to go and be and express our sexuality is not just okay, but it becomes a heroic thing actually, that like no matter how anyone else sees you, no matter what anyone else thinks, you are being you authentically.
Yeah. Something I must do.
Yeah, you must do, and you're right to do it. You're brave to do it. It's heroic
Mm.
to do it, and this is where it becomes enmeshed a little bit in the power and oppression story, where if you're in a sexual minority, um, then to some extent, y- y- you're because you're in the minority position, heteronormativity is seen as
Like
the
a
power block that is potentially and actually oppressive to you in your sexual minority. And social justice demands then not just that we treat every sexuality equally, but it demands more than that, that power and voice um, should be given as much as possible to those in the minority position, and that heteronormativity needs to be deconstructed and problematized. And again, I think we can sort of see that playing out quite obviously in our culture.
Okay, so I can see how that all of that paints a picture of
Mm.
how we see sex in our culture, and also how it affects our marriage and sexuality. Um, it's clear how those things tie together. But one thing that I've noticed that you haven't said is whether or not those things are good or bad.
Yeah, on the whole, I think we've probably indicated certain directions at times, but on the whole, we've tried to be descriptive really so far. It's just, I think this is how we see these things in our
You're
culture.
saying what the worldview is, not
Yeah.
whether or not you think it's
Yeah,
bad.
I think hopefully this is an accurate description of how we see these things. How we evaluate them then
Mm.
is a different question. Is our cultural worldview leading us to a good place? Does what our worldview tells us about sex, is that fit with reality as we experience it? Does it lead to human flourishing? These are the evaluative questions
Yeah.
that we do need to come to.
Yeah, because for some people, some people would say that the sexual revolution has been a really good thing for people.
Yeah, most people perhaps would think that we've been able to throw off the old authorities that were
Yeah.
oppressing us, whether that's the church
Mhm.
or traditional values or expectations. And we've been able to get rid of all that repressive stuff
Yeah.
and been able to really live into who we are.
Yeah, be who we are.
Yeah, to lean into the joys and the satisfaction of free love.
That all sounds a little bit naive, though. It's a little bit rose-tinted spectacles, maybe?
Yeah, and that's what we're going to turn to in the second half of this evening. This is the theory. This is what it's meant to be like in our cultural worldview of sex, sexuality, and marriage. But now we need to turn to see how is this actually playing out in our lives.
Okay, so where are we gonna start?
I'd like to start by going back to Louise Perry's book, Case Against the Sexual Revolution, where she makes the basic argument throughout her book that the sexual revolution and the permissive society that it's brought in its aftermath has worked out much better for men than it has for women.
Okay.
So the first point that she raises is this. She says, the research is clear. We know that men, on average, prefer to have more sex and with a larger number of partners, that sex buyers are almost exclusively male, that men watch a lot more porn than women do, and that the vast majority of women, if given the option, prefer a committed relationship to casual sex. Sexual fetishes, also known as paraphilias, are also much more commonly found in men than in women. And although the cause of this difference is not well understood, men's greater average sociosexuality seems to be a factor. All in all, the evidence demonstrates that the acts that have become much more socially acceptable over the last 60 years are acts that men are much more likely to enjoy. It's a good time to be a fetishist, a sex buyer, a porn user, and a playboy. It is the highly sociosexual who have done the best out of sexual liberalism, and these people are overwhelmingly male. So, really, her argument is that our sexually permissive culture is suiting men's sexual preferences much more than women's sexual preferences. But of course, the culture's all pushing us
Yeah.
in the same direction, both men and women. Another point that Perry makes is that the permissive culture is much more dangerous for women than for men because of the physical differences between men and women. So men are much stronger than women. On the average man
Yeah.
can kill your average woman with their bare hands, whereas not vice versa. Almost all rapists are men. And insisting on consent doesn't actually stop the people who want to commit rape anyway. And we know that porn is influencing more and more men in showing violent and coercive sex and normalizing that kind of thing. And yet, despite all of this, women are still being encouraged to buy into the permissive society where they should put themselves in a situation of having casual sex with people they don't know that well, and these sort of vulnerable situations. But the costs are massive, and
Yeah.
that's what the stats show us. 1 in 4 women and 1 in 6 children will be sexually assaulted at some point in their life. And in fact, every year, 1 in 30 women experiences rape or sexual assault, which are just huge numbers, aren't they, really? Um, and, and Louise Perry's point, the title of one of her chapters, is that consent is not enough. That you can keep banging on about the importance of consent and consent as a moral principle, but in a culture that is normalizing this approach to sex,
Yeah.
that won't be enough
Mhm.
to stop the damage and the harm that's happening to women.
Yeah, I think that's really true because, you know, somebody might consent in a strictly legal sense
Yeah.
to something, but actually underneath all that may feel under pressure. Um, Even if that's not from the other person, they might feel pressure just from the culture around them to
Yeah.
be acting in a certain way or
This is how you should be.
yeah, yeah. But it still might mean they might wake up one day and feel like devastated or really regretful about something they've done. But actually, they didn't say no,
Yeah,
but
yeah.
it can be a deep source of regret.
Yeah, absolutely right, really. One final point from Perry is that sexual liberalism will always take a bigger toll on women because of our bodies again. Even though our permissive culture encourages us to highly value the freedom to express our individual sexual preferences, she writes this, that the logic of individualism collapses upon contact with motherhood. The pregnant woman's frame contains two people, neither of them truly autonomous. The unborn baby depends on the mother for survival, and the mother cannot break this physical bond except through medical intervention that will result in the baby's death. Even after birth, the mother-baby dyad remains a unit tied together, both emotionally and physically. And this is why the permissive society only really got off the ground when the pill became widely available, because it greatly reduced the risk of women conceiving when they didn't want to. But Perry's point is a bit beyond that, really, that even with the pill, there's still an increased cost to women. Because she says the sexual revolution gave women the opportunity to make the choice not to wait until marriage. But when motherhood became a biological choice for women, fatherhood became a social choice for men. In other words, what she's saying is that the way our culture teaches us to think about sex means that there's less incentive than ever for men to stick in the relationship. Is less incentive for marriages to be entered into and maintained. And because of our biology, the load is going to fall much heavier on women who bear the baby than the men who don't.
We have less choice in the matter
In that
once
way.
the baby's here.
Yeah. Yeah, that's right.
But you're not saying that most men want to have sex and then would just leave a pregnant partner. I'm guessing that's not what you're saying.
Well, not all men anyway, but Perry's point really is that our sexually permissive culture doesn't incentivize the kind of behavior that works best for women. It incentivizes the kind of behavior that works best for men.
Right. But the cost isn't only to women. Like you said before, the cost is also to children, isn't it?
It is, yeah. We might say that sex is a private act and insist on that, but the truth is that it has very public consequences, which are children. And yeah, the research shows that children don't seem to be doing too well out of our current attitudes towards sex and marriage. So here's some statistics from the UK for you.
Okay.
Nowadays, it's true that nearly half of all children don't grow up with mum and dad for all of their childhood. So at some point, they're not living with mum or not living with their dad. And say 23% of all families are single parent families. And if you stretch that rather than just one point in time to a 6-year period, then that becomes a third of all families.
Wow. So family breakdown is just massive,
Yeah.
isn't it? It's a massive thing in our society. And to think that every other child is not living at home with mum and dad at the same time for at least part of their life.
Yeah.
And, I think we represent that as well in our lives. So I came from a home where I didn't live with both my parents, but you came from a home where you did.
Yeah, so we kind of model the statistic in that sense that it's 50-50. And the results of this, I think, are pretty well documented, the impact of family breakdown. It seems to be fairly well known that fatherlessness is connected to things like higher rates of imprisonment, higher rates of teenage pregnancy, higher rates of all kinds of social problems, really. But it goes a little bit beyond just those cold measures. So I want to share with you a little bit of research by the Centre for Social Justice, which is a political think tank. They published some research about mental health and family breakdown. And they concluded that family breakdown in all its forms is strongly associated with poor mental health in adults and children. The role family breakdown plays in the causes of mental disorder is frequently unacknowledged, but recent research highlights the association between mental illness and coming from fractured, dysfunctional, and fatherless families. Children with parents in conflict or with separated single or step parents are significantly more likely to fail at school, have low self-esteem, struggle with peer relationships, and have behavioural difficulties, anxiety, and depression.
And I suppose we have to acknowledge that we're not saying that that's true for every single person that
Yeah.
comes from a broken home.
Yeah, this is
But
dealing
yeah,
generalities rather so
general
there'll be
generalities.
people that this won't be true of.
Yeah,
But in general, this will be true, and it's no coincidence that the huge rise in family breakdown and single parent homes has come at the same time as the sexual revolution
yeah,
and changing attitudes to sex and marriage, because both of these things are driven by the same fundamental worldview that doesn't just affect what we believe, but affects how we behave.
yeah.
Um, it turns out that there are significant consequences from
Mm,
this worldview.
yeah. Like you say, it makes sense really that these are the consequences, because if the message is sort of be yourself, don't be restricted, then we're not being restricted in our choices, are we? And
No?
these are the consequences that we're seeing of how we're living.
And that desire to be not restricted, we shouldn't be surprised that another characteristic, another consequence is this flight from boundaries and norms that we see,
Mm.
that every taboo is there to be broken, every boundary is there to be overcome. If it limits my freedom to be who I am
Yeah,
or who I want to be, then it needs to be deconstructed and taken apart. And we see that massively over the last 60 years. So
yeah,
here's some obvious examples. Before the 1960s, most people thought sex before marriage was wrong.
mm,
Nowadays, the vast majority of people think that sex outside and before marriage is totally fine. Another really obvious example would be that back as recently as 1967, homosexuality was still illegal in the UK, whereas the last legal act around homosexuality was legalizing same sex marriages in
yeah.
2013. So that shows, again, a
Big,
massive shift in attitudes towards homosexuality. Pornography, we've already talked about. But extreme sex, BDSM, this sort of thing has become increasingly normalized in popular culture. So the sort of 50 Shades of Grey phenomenon
yeah, yeah,
is a huge change in this, again, transgressing of boundaries, breaking of boundaries. And as we saw in part 3 of Unravelling, the boundaries between male and female have become increasingly challenged
yeah.
in our culture. And we've got new views of gender that have emerged, a continual sort of breaking and changing of boundaries over the last 60 years.
And are you saying then that all of this breaking of the boundaries, that it's all wrong, it's all harmful?
No, I'm not saying that at all. Again, I'm just being descriptive here. This is what's happened, and I gave a range of different examples, and we'd
Yeah.
probably evaluate those differently.
Hmm.
Um,
Yeah, because some sexual boundaries do remain, don't they? We don't,
yeah,
by and large, like incest
yeah,
it's still seen as wrong. That's still illegal. Paedophilia, those boundaries have not yet been crossed.
yeah. You've picked two that are still illegal in the UK, and that
Yeah,
okay, common sense
yeah,
is that those things wrong. But I'd want to quote Louise Perry again on this actually, because she makes an interesting point here. She writes that we sometimes forget quite how different attitudes towards child sexual abuse really were in the 1970s and the 1980s. So this is only 50 years ago, 40 to 50 years ago. In Britain, members of the Paedophile Information Exchange were openly campaigning for the abolition of the age of consent and found themselves welcomed warmly in some establishment circles, with Margaret Thatcher's government refusing demands to ban the group. In some European countries at this time, child pornography was freely available. Um, Sweden, for example, is one example where this was the case, having been legalized at the same time as other forms of pornography from the end of the 1960s. And in 1977, a petition to the French Parliament calling for the decriminalization of sex between adults and children was signed by a long list of famous intellectuals, including Jean-Paul Sartre, Jacques Derrida, and that esteemed radical father of queer theory, Michael Foucault. So those names might not be familiar to many of us, but these were leading intellectuals in France at the time in philosophy and theology and literary theory. Those names, Sartre, Derrida, Foucault, they may not be familiar to most of us. So it's important to say that these were leading public intellectuals in Europe at the time in theology and philosophy, literary theory. These were like a big deal. And so for these guys to be behind this just shows how in the public
yeah,
this kind of movement was. And as Perry argues, this movement came from the place of tapping into the consent and the harm principle, saying that actually some children are able to consent and it's not harmful for them to be able to express their sexual desires in sex with adults. And so and really interestingly, they positioned this movement as a sexual minority who were interested in this kind of sex, who were being oppressed by the moral views of the majority, which is an interesting given
Yeah.
what we've explored about the shape of how our
Yeah.
culture sees sex now, really. So Perry sums her own point up like this. She says, when you set out to break down sexual taboos, you shouldn't be surprised when all taboos are considered fair game for breaking, including the ones you'd rather retain. The principles of sexual liberalism, she's sorry to say, trundle inexorably towards this endpoint, whether or not we want them to.
So, if only the moral boundaries that we have now are consent and harm,
Yeah.
then I suppose we can see that even that can be challenged,
Yeah.
even that can be questioned. We can say things like, "Is that really harmful?" Or
Yeah.
consent really needed? If we certainly when we're
Or is consent possible
yeah,
in these
yeah,
situations? Yeah.
can we do that or not?
Yeah.
So we can even test the boundaries that we've got now, the taboos that we've got now. Certainly for things like incest, for example.
Yeah. Is consent possible in incest? Absolutely. And incest is actually a pretty popular porn category. The research shows it's clearly a sexual interest for at least some of us.
Mm. That's really interesting going through that, and I think that we can see on the two sides we've got that the sexual revolution seems like it's this brilliant thing,
Yeah.
and we're now free to be who we are and love who we want to love and act how we want to act. But then on the other hand, we have these questions of, are we really free?
Yeah.
Are we really happy
Yeah.
with all this freedom? Is it really
Yeah.
doing us any good?
Yeah.
And it seems to me that actually it's costing us quite a lot.
Yeah. Is it really leading to our flourishing? And having just looked at what some of us will consider pretty extreme cases, really, incest, paedophilia, that sort of thing, I think it's probably important now to bring it back to the impact that the sexual revolution is having on all of us, and some of the ways that this view of sex and marriage and sexuality in our culture is damaging to all of us.
Okay, so how is it damaging to us?
So I think the important things to say here, one of them is that we still feel empty. We still feel empty. Our culture promises us that happiness and satisfaction is something that we can achieve by leaning into eros, really, into sex, into romantic love. This will meet our needs. This will be our greatest pleasures. But the truth is that it's just not like that. We can have loads of sex and still feel really lonely.
Mm-hmm.
We can be in good, warm, healthy, happy marriages
Yeah.
and still ache because we have a need for love that our partner's not able to fully provide. We can express and fully live out as much as possible our sexuality, but still feel not fully accepted, still not really know who we are and feel lost. And so there's a constant over-promising and under-delivering that's going on in the aftermath of the sexual revolution. We're promised so much.
Yeah.
But as I think you said a bit earlier in this video, we can wake up one day and it's not that.
Yeah. It's not delivering
It
what
hasn't,
it's going to deliver.
it hasn't satisfied our need for love. And that has a huge impact because it becomes a little bit of a vicious circle that then we push harder into those things to try and get what we need, and they continue not to deliver. But we don't know where else to go.
Yeah.
So we go back in a more extreme way, really. And this is made worse by the fact that we are all having to live in contradiction, as we talked about earlier. That has an impact on all of us as well. That whole idea of sex is everything and nothing. We just know that isn't true.
Yeah.
Like,
how can they both be true?
Liz, if someone's going to ask you for a sexual favour, that is not the same for you as someone asking for a practical favour. We know they're different things. We know that sexual abuse is different from other forms of physical abuse.
Yeah.
We know that. And yet, we're told that we can have casual sex without significant consequences. So when we do that, when we have casual sex, and there are significant consequences, but we're told that there sort of shouldn't be significant consequences, then maybe we're the problem. And this sense of reality doesn't make sense if this is true. And that's a really painful thing for all of us, I think, can leave us in a bad place. And to some extent, all of us are sexually broken people.
Yeah.
If we're able to be honest with ourselves and think about it deeply enough, we're all sexually broken people. We've talked on this video a lot about the impact on women and children, but these things I've just been talking about impact on men equally as well. The sense of being empty, they're having to live in contradiction.
Yeah.
And let me be clear that I don't think that we're just sexually broken because of the sexual revolution. If the sexual revolution hadn't happened, we'd still all be sexually broken people for reasons that we're going to talk about on the next video.
Okay.
But it certainly hasn't helped us. I think it pushed us deeper and deeper into our pain.
Yeah.
So I think this touches all of us. So some of my story is that I suffered with pornography addiction for several years earlier on in my life. And that has left its scars. It's left its scars in my brain, in the neural pathways that are there, the ways that I tend to think that are damaging, the things that are going to trigger certain reactions in me that come from that time. It's left its scars in my marriage. There's a brokenness there that me and my wife have had to face and confront and work through. It's had an impact on really practical things like I can't have a smartphone.
Yeah.
Because the temptation of the privacy and the availability of kind of tempting stuff in there would be too much for me. So would I have been sexually broken if pornography hadn't been as available as it was when I was a young man? Yeah, I'd still have been sexually broken, but perhaps not in this way.
Yeah. Certainly hasn't helped.
It certainly hasn't helped. It's had a significant impact on me. And I'd say it's exposed me to my sexual brokenness in a particular way. Well, my sexual brokenness would have been there in some way, but our culture has exposed me to that in a particular way. And others will have their own stories, really. And in some ways, this is where unraveling comes into every home. I don't think there is a single home that won't be untouched by our sexual brokenness.
And so where does that leave us all? Has it all been bad? Has the sexual revolution just been a complete disaster? And do we have any hope?
Yeah, I don't want to give that impression that there's been nothing good out of the sexual revolution. Say, for example, one of the good things has been it has caused us to consider a much more positive account of sex and the body. And that's been really helpful in combating some of the views of sex where it was intrinsically dirty and shameful and negative. And again, we'll talk about that more on the next video. So that's been good. I think it has been good news for sexual minorities who have seen attitudes towards them massively change. And some of the stuff that they suffered has been reduced as a result of the sexual revolution. So all of that and more is to be welcomed.
Yep.
However, we do still need to ask the question, is the way that we see sex in our culture really leading to human flourishing? Or is it leading us into a set of beliefs that aren't true and a set of behaviours that are actually causing us to suffer? What is it that actually leads to human flourishing? Is it true that it's good to separate sex from marriage? Is it true that it's good to define ourselves by our sexual identities? Like, is sex meaningful or isn't it meaningful? And if it is meaningful, what does it mean? What is the purpose of sex? But perhaps most importantly of all, if sex isn't nothing and it isn't everything, then what is the bigger picture and the bigger story that actually makes sense of sex and allows us to understand how sex plays a role in human flourishing and how we can make sense of it in a way that doesn't lead us to living in unreality, but actually fits with our real experience of the world? That question, I think, is the one of most importance. What is the big picture that makes sense of sex? I think that our culture doesn't have convincing answers to that question. Even people like Louise Perry can see the problems really well and articulate them in a really compelling way, but she doesn't have an alternative on a worldview level.
Okay.
In a sense, she can help us see what the problems are, but can't offer an alternative way of making sense of sex that would lead us into any solutions. But that's what we need, because if we don't have a different worldview, we're not going to have the resources we need for a different way of living.
And the point of unravelling is that there is a different worldview.
That's right. The Christian worldview has a different story to tell about sex and marriage and sexuality, one that I believe is more true to reality, that shows us how sex fits in with the bigger picture of our lives, and one that gives us hope that our sexual brokenness can actually be transformed into human flourishing.
Thank you so much. And I'm really looking forward to discussing more next time when we meet. So that's it for this video. We really hope that this has helped you to think a little bit more about sex in our culture, think about it in terms of marriage, in terms of sexuality. If you want to check out more of our videos, then check out Unravelling, check out our YouTube channel, and we'll see you then. Please visit www.amblecocc.org.uk/unravelling.